My son was already checking the resale value of my engagement ring, while my blood was still being scrubbed off the pavement of I-95. The world ended on a Tuesday in November, a day swallowed by a sky the color of a bruised plum. In Connecticut, the autumn doesn't just fade. It dies in a violent spray of crimson leaves and freezing rain. I was 64 years old, a woman who had spent 42 years as an oncology nurse, standing sentinel at the border between life and death. I had held the hands of thousands as they crossed over, whispering comfort into the ears of the departing. But I never realized that the most terrifying silence wasn't the absence of a heartbeat. It was the presence of a predator who shared your DNA. The accident itself was a blur of physics and failure. One moment, I was driving home from a late shift, my mind drifting toward the sourdough starter waiting on my kitchen counter. The next, the silver needles of the storm turned into a sheet of black ice. There was a sickening screech, a sound like a giant tearing a silk sheet in half, and then the world inverted. The airbag was a white explosion of dust and heat, and the crunch of the Corolla's frame sounded like the snapping of dry kindling. Then, the most profound darkness I have ever known descended, a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of ozone and wet asphalt. When the light returned, it wasn't the light of the sun. It was the sterile, flickering fluorescence of the intensive care unit, a place I knew better than my own living room. But the perspective had shifted. I was no longer the one checking the IV bags or adjusting the morphine drips. I was the body in the bed. I was the patient in room 402. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I was a prisoner in a tomb made of my own skin. But my hearing was preternaturally sharp, as if the universe had stripped away my other senses, just to ensure I wouldn't miss a single word of the betrayal that was about to unfold. I heard the door hiss open. I recognized the gate before I heard the voice, the heavy, impatient stride of my only son, Julian. For 35 years, I had loved him, with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. I had worked double shifts at the hospital until my ankles were swollen and my back was a map of chronic pain, all so he could have the best. Private schools, elite soccer camps, a debt-free degree from NYU. I had poured my life into his vessel, never imagining the vessel was cracked. The neurosurgeon said the brain swelling is significant, Julian said. His voice didn't tremble with grief. It was flat, analytical, the tone he used when discussing quarterly tax projections. Even if she pulls through, the rehabilitation costs are going to be astronomical. We're talking years of specialized care, Tiffany. It's a total drain. But Julian, she's your mother, my daughter-in-law, Tiffany replied. There was a pause, and I could practically hear her checking her reflection in the darkened window of my room. Doesn't she have insurance? Medicare covers the basics, but for the kind of facility she'd need. It'll eat through her savings in months, Julian snapped. And then what? We start dipping into our equity to keep a woman who doesn't even know her own name alive. I've looked at the numbers. The house in Greenwich, as the retirement fund, the stocks. If she stays in this state for 6 months, 40% of our inheritance is gone. Just poof, vaporized by hospital bills. Our inheritance. The words felt like physical blows to my chest, yet my heart rate monitor continued its steady, rhythmic beep, 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 oblivious to the fact that I was dying emotionally in real time. He wasn't mourning his mother, He was auditing a liability. He was standing 3 feet away from the woman who had nursed him through pneumonia, who had sold her own mother's heirloom jewelry to pay for his first business venture, and he was mourning the loss of a future paycheck. The lawyer said the power of attorney is ironclad, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. If we move now, we can transfer the liquid assets into the trust before the medical lions hit. We have to protect the estate, Tiff. It's what she would have wanted. She always said she wanted us to be successful. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that what I wanted was to live. I wanted to tell him that the money he was so eager to protect was the blood and sweat of 4 decades of labor. I remembered the nights I spent in the oncology ward, cleaning up vomit and holding the basins for patients who had no one else, all while thinking that my hard work would provide a safety net for my sunset years. I never realized I was just building a gilded cage for myself. Mom is a burden now, Julian said, and I heard the sound of a pen clicking, the sound of a death warrant being drafted with a designer fountain pen. I can't support a ghost, Tiff. I have a life. We have a life. I'm signing the DNR today. The doctors say it's the humane thing to do, but let's be honest. It's the only way to save what's left of the family's future. The humiliation was a cold, oily tide that rose up to my chin, to be discussed like a piece of depreciating machinery, to be appraised and found wanting by the person I had loved most in the world, was a pain far worse than the shattered ribs and the bruised brain. He thought I was gone. He thought the quiet wisdom he had always mocked was finally extinguished. He was wrong. Behind my closed eyelids, in the dark, silent theater of my mind, a new fire was being lit. It wasn't the warm, nurturing hearth of a mother. It was the cold, blue flame of a survivor. Julian had forgotten one thing in his rush to divide the spoils. I was a nurse. I knew how to survive the unsurvivable. And more importantly, I knew exactly where the bodies and the bank accounts were buried. He had pushed me to rock bottom, thinking I would stay there. He didn't realize that rock bottom is the perfect place to build a foundation for a reckoning. As the trash envelope of a state-funded facility loomed in my future, I made a silent vow. I would wake up, and when I did, I would show my son the true cost of abandoning the woman who gave him everything. The punch had landed, and it had broken my heart, but the dignity was just beginning to rise. There is a specific kind of horror in being a ghost before you are actually dead. In the sterile, air-conditioned purgatory of the ICU, I discovered that the human soul doesn't leave the body all at once. It retreats into the corners, watching from the shadows of its own eyelids. I was a prisoner in a tomb of meat and bone, my only windows to the world being the rhythmic hiss-purr of the ventilator and the cold clinical scent of floor wax. But while my body was a collapsed star, my mind was a lighthouse, spinning and searching, catching every jagged word that fell from my son's lips. Julian entered the room with a stride that lacked the heavy cadence of grief. I knew his walk, the confident, hurried pace of a man who viewed time as currency. He didn't come to my bedside to stroke my hair or whisper that he loved me, or he came to stand at the foot of the bed, his silhouette a dark blotch against the harsh fluorescent lights, consulting with Tiffany like they were reviewing a failing quarterly report. The neurosurgeon was being optimistic, Tiff, Julian said. his voice flat and devoid of the tremor I had heard when he was a boy crying over a scraped knee. He's talking about neuroplasticity and long-term rehabilitation. Do you have any idea what the daily rate is for a private neuro rehab center in Connecticut? It's $3,000, minimum. But she's stable, Julian, Tiffany replied. I could hear the rustle of her silk scarf. The doctors say her vitals are strong. She might come back. Might doesn't pay the mortgage on the Greenwich house, Julian snapped. I heard the sharp click of his lighter. He always was impatient. We have to look at the burn rate. If she lingers like this for 6 months, the estate is gutted. The equity I was counting on to bridge the gap for the new firm, gone. The kids' Ivy League fund, evaporated. We are literally watching our future bleed out into these IV bags. I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and demand to know when I had become a burn rate. I wanted to remind him that the Greenwich house he so desperately wanted to protect was sitting on a foundation I had poured with my own sweat. My mind drifted back, escaping the cold ICU, to the sweltering summer of 1998. That was the year the textile mill closed, and my husband's pride broke along with our bank account. Julian was 14, a boy with champagne tastes and a hunger for status that I, in my quiet wisdom, had mistaken for ambition. And I didn't want him to feel the shame of the final notice stickers on our door. I remembered the taste of iron in the back of my throat as I worked 72 hours a week. I was an oncology nurse by day, and by night I took on private home care shifts for the wealthy dying. I remembered the purple bruises on the insides of my elbows, not from an accident, but from the plasma centers I visited twice a week in the city. I sold my blood so he could have the varsity jackets, the SAT prep courses, and the ego that eventually became his armor. I had literally drained myself to keep his world full. I had been the silent architect of his success, the one who worked in the shadows so he could stand in the sun. And now, standing in the sun I had bought for him, he was calculating the cost-benefit of my heartbeat. Mom is a burden now, Tiff. Let's call a spade, Julian continued. I heard the sound of him scrolling on his phone, checking stocks, checking the weather. I've already looked into the state-funded facility in Bridgeport. It's bleak, sure, but they take the Medicare assignment. It protects the rest of the assets. It's the logical move. She's 70. She's had her run. Why should 3 generations suffer because of one bad turn on an icy road? The humiliation was a cold, oily tide. He was discussing me as if I were a piece of depreciating machinery, an old car that was no longer worth the repairs. To him, my 40 years of service, my sacrifices, and the very blood I had sold to put him through college were just sunk costs. He had become a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I lay there, a ghost in the room, realizing that my son's heart was a ledger, where love was only recorded if it yielded a profit. The empathy I had felt for him for decades, the excuses I made for his coldness, the way I blamed his father's failures for his obsession with wealth, died in that ICU room. It was replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. He thought I was checked out. He thought the quiet wisdom of his mother had finally been silenced by a traumatic brain injury. He didn't realize that in the silence of my paralysis, I was conducting an audit of my own. He had forgotten that while he was playing with his spreadsheets, I was the one who had built the trust accounts. He had forgotten that the life estate clause he was so eager to circumvent was a double-edged sword. As the nurse came in to check my vitals, Julian put on his grieving son mask, his voice dropping an octave into a rehearsed somberness. But I wasn't fooled. The ghost was waking up, and she was no longer interested in being a sacrifice. I had spent a lifetime providing for him, but as I felt the first faint, stinging prick of sensation in my right hand, I knew what my next provision would be, a lesson in the high cost of betrayal. Julian wanted to cut his losses. Fine. I would help him. But he was about to find out that when you cut the hand that feeds you, the only thing you're left with is a very long, very hungry winter. The sound of a pen scratching against a clipboard can be a death knell when the hand holding it belongs to your own flesh and blood. As I lay there, my world reduced to the four corners of a ceiling tile and the rhythmic mocking thump hiss of the ventilator, I watched Julian perform a forensic audit of my remaining days. He wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for an exit strategy. He wasn't praying for my recovery. He was praying for a clean transition of my portfolio before the hospital's billing department could take a bite out of his rightful inheritance. "The transfer orders are ready, Mr. Vance," a voice said, flat, bureaucratic, and devoid of the warmth I used to bring to my own patients. It was the hospital social worker, a woman who had clearly seen too many families crumble under the weight of a catastrophic deductible. "And Mercy West has a bed available?" Julian asked. He didn't even look at me. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the gray Connecticut afternoon, looking out at the parking lot as if he couldn't wait to get back to his Tesla and drive away from the burden I had become. "They do," the social worker replied. "It's a state-funded ward. It's basic. But given that you've indicated there are no private funds available for long-term care, it's the only viable option." I felt a surge of white-hot lightning behind my eyes. No private funds? I had nearly $3 million in a diversified trust. I had a paid-off colonial in Greenwich that was worth a small fortune. And I had a retirement account I'd fed with every overtime hour, every holiday shift, and every missed vacation for 40 years. But Julian was lying. He was telling the world I was a pauper, so he could hoard the gold. He was stripping me of my history, my hard work, and my care, all to ensure that his lifestyle wouldn't skip a single beat. "Mom is a burden, Tiff," Julian whispered, leaning into his wife as the social worker stepped out to finalize the trash envelope of my future. "I can't support her. I literally can't. If I pay for the private wing, we lose the summer house. If I pay for the 24-hour nursing, we can't afford the new landscaping for the Greenwich estate. I'm not being cruel. I'm being practical. She's 70. She's had a good run. Why should we all drown just because she hit a patch of ice?" So this is how it ends, I thought, the sorrow choking me more effectively than any intubation tube ever could. I am a sunk cost. I am a bad investment. I watched him pick up my personal effects bag, the clear plastic bag the paramedics had stuffed my things into. He reached in and pulled out my watch, a modest gold Cartier I'd bought myself after 25 years at the hospital. He turned it over in his hand, his eyes narrowing as he checked the hallmark. "We should probably list this on eBay," he muttered to Tiffany. Every little bit helps cover the incidentals we've already spent on gas and parking coming here." He tossed the bag back onto the rolling table with a dismissive thud. It hit the tray where my "do not resuscitate" order sat, the paper he had signed with such terrifying alacrity. To him, my life was now just a series of incidentals. I was a mess to be cleaned up, a bill to be settled, a ghost to be exorcised from his spreadsheet. "I'm signing the final waiver now," Julian said, his voice regaining that arrogant, decisive edge. "Once she's moved to Mercy West, her medical debt becomes the state's problem, not ours. We'll have the Greenwich house listed by Friday. We can tell the neighbors she moved to a specialized retreat in the Berkshires. It sounds better than a state ward in Bridgeport." The humiliation was a physical weight, a cold stone in my gut. He was already planning the lie. He was already selling the roof over my head while I was still underneath it. I remembered the nights I stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him with his business school applications, the way I'd coached him through his first big failure, and the way I'd always told him that family was the only thing that mattered. Did they really think I had become that senile? I wondered, the fragmented voice in my head sharpening into a blade of cold, strategic intelligence. Julian leaned over me then. For a second I hoped, he might kiss my forehead. I hoped he might whisper that he was sorry, that he was just scared. But instead, he just checked his reflection in the glass of my heart rate monitor, straightening his silk tie. "Rest easy, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily pity. "We're taking care of everything. You don't have to worry about a thing anymore. We've got it all under control." He had no idea. As he walked out of the room, his arm around Tiffany, already discussing where they should go for dinner to decompress from the stress of my situation, I felt a microscopic twitch in my right hand. It was faint, no more than a flicker, but it was there. He thought he was signing my life away. He thought he was closing the ledger on Evelyn Vance. But as the cold calculation of his greed echoed in the silent room, I made a silent vow. He wanted to talk about assets. He wanted to talk about control. I would give him a lesson in both. He had forgotten who had taught him how to count. He had forgotten that I was the one who held the keys to the kingdom he was so eager to steal. He had pushed me to rock bottom, thinking the fall would kill me. He didn't realize that rock bottom is the most solid ground there is for building a trap. The punch had been delivered. My heart was shattered. But in the wreckage, the weapon was beginning to form. He thought he was moving a burden to Mercy West. He didn't realize he was leaving a predator in wait. "I am not a burden, Julian. I am the woman who built you. And I can just as easily be the woman who unmasks you. The night in the ICU is never truly dark. It is a bruised electric purple, vibrating with the low hum of machines that are keeping you tethered to a world that seems determined to let you go." As I lay there, the silence was a heavy blanket, allowing my mind to wander back through the decades, searching for the moment the son I adored turned into the stranger who wanted me gone. I found myself sifting through the wreckage of 1998, a year that felt like a lifetime ago, yet as vivid as the sterile scent of the oxygen mask on my face. That was the year the bottom fell out, when the local textile mill shuttered its doors, and Julian's father gave up on life long before his heart actually stopped. I was left standing in a kitchen with a stack of past due notices that reached my chin. Julian was 14, a boy who desperately wanted to belong to the world of the Greenwich elite, even though we were living on the ragged edge of the working class. He had his heart set on the traveling soccer league, a world of private buses, expensive cleats, and parents who smelled like old money and expensive gin. I remember the day I looked at the registration fee and realized it was more than our monthly grocery budget. I didn't tell him no. I couldn't. I had this misguided, bone-deep belief that if I could just shield him from the ugliness of our struggle, he would grow up with the confidence of a king. So I started, burning the candle at both ends until there was no wax left. I was already working 40 hours a week as a floor nurse, but that didn't cover the extras. I remember the cold, fluorescent lights of the Plasma Donation Center in Bridgeport. I went there twice a week, every week, for 3 years. I can still feel the thick, cold bite of the 16-gauge needle as it entered the vein in my right arm, the same arm that was now bruised and useless on this hospital bed. I would sit in those cracked plastic chairs for 90 minutes at a time, watching my own life force swirl through a plastic tube, separated and sold for $40 a pop. I'd walk out of there dizzy, my arm throbbing, with a purple bruise that looked like a permanent stain. I'd hide it under my long-sleeved nursing scrubs. I'd take that $40 and put it directly into Julian's soccer fund jar. He never asked where the money came from. He just assumed the world provided for him because he was special. "So this is how he repays me," the fragmented voice in my head whispered, the words echoing against the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Did I sell my blood so he could buy a faster car while I rot in a state ward? I thought about the double shifts, the holidays I missed. While Julian was opening presents or attending New Year's Eve parties with his wealthy friends, I was in the oncology ward. I spent my Christmases emptying bedpans and holding the hands of strangers who were taking their final breaths. I did it so Julian could have the designer labels he craved, the tutors who polished his edges, and the NYU tuition that I paid for in installments of sweat and exhaustion. I worked until my feet were so swollen I had to cut my nursing shoes with a razor blade just to get them off at night. I gave him a silver spoon life, but I forged that spoon out of my own marrow, and now Julian sat in my house, and called me a burden. He spoke about my medical journey as if it were a flat tire on his way to a more important meeting. The empathy I had felt for him for 30 years, the way I had made excuses for his arrogance and his materialistic streak, began to feel like a poison I had been slowly feeding myself. I had raised him to be a consumer, and I was horrified to realize that I had finally become the product. Did they really think I had become that senile, I wondered, a cold, sharp clarity beginning to pierce through the fog of my medication. I remembered the look on his face when he bought that Tesla last year. He'd come over to my cottage, bragging about the autopilot and the leather interior, never once mentioning that the down payment had come from the emergency fund I'd set up for him. I had smiled, poured him tea, and told him I was proud of his success. I had been a doormat, and I'd painted a welcome sign on my own back. As the night wore on, the quiet wisdom that had guided me through 40 years of nursing began to shift into something more strategic. I thought about the family limited partnership I'd set up a decade ago. Julian thought it was just a tax dodge. He thought the Greenwich house was his because his name was on the limited partner line. He'd forgotten, or perhaps he'd never actually read, the fine print. And he didn't realize that the general partner, me, held the power to dissolve the entire structure if the limited partner showed gross negligence or bad faith. The betrayal was the punch that had pushed me to rock bottom, but the memory of sacrifice was the ladder I was going to use to climb back up. I wasn't just a mother, I was a woman who had survived the 1998 crash, the loss of a husband, and the literal draining of my own blood. He thought I was a ghost. He thought I was a non-responsive liability. But as I lay there, feeling the agonizingly slow return of sensation in my fingertips, I made a silent vow. I had spent a lifetime building his empire. Now I was going to enjoy the spectacle of watching it crumble, brick by greedy brick. My kindness was never a doormat, Julian. It was a bridge. And since you've decided to burn it while I'm still on it, don't be surprised when you find yourself treading water in a very cold, very deep ocean. The empathy was officially dead. The secret was waiting. And I was finally, quietly waking up. The first thing I did when I clawed my way back from the gray abyss was lie to the person I loved most in the world. It wasn't a lie of malice, it was a lie of survival. On the 25th morning, while the sun bled a pale, apologetic gold through the blinds of the ICU, my brain finally reconnected with my body. It started with a pinprick in my toes, then a thrumming heat in my thighs, and finally, the heavy, rusted gate of my consciousness swung wide open. A young nurse named Elena was checking my vitals. She looked tired, her scrubs wrinkled from a long night. I waited until we were alone. The door hissed shut, and the constant mechanical chatter of the hallway faded. "Elena," I rasped. My voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. She nearly dropped her clipboard, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and professional delight. "Evelyn? Oh my God, you're back. You're actually back." She reached for the call button to summon the neurosurgeon, her face flushed with the thrill of a clinical miracle. "Wait," I whispered, my hand, pale and thin but moving, clutching her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't call them. Not yet. Please." She hesitated, her brow furrowed. "But your son? He's been so worried. He needs to know." "My son," I said, and the name felt like ash in my mouth, "is the reason I need you to stay quiet for just 1 hour. Give me 1 hour of privacy, Elena, as one nurse to another. Please." There is a silent language between nurses, a shared understanding of the things patients see when the world thinks they are asleep. Elena looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the cold, a sharp clarity in my eyes. She nodded slowly, stepped back, and pulled the curtain tight. She handed me the hospital's patient tablet, ostensibly so I could watch the news, and then she slipped out. With trembling fingers, I bypassed the wellness app and opened the browser. My mind, sharpened by 40 years of medical charts and the strategic intelligence that had kept our family afloat through 3 recessions, went straight to the heart of the matter. I logged into the Vance Family Trust. So this is how they repay me, I thought, my eyes scanning the ledger. Did they really think I had become that senile? Julian had been busy. While I was a ghost in the room, he had used his power of attorney to divert my liquid savings into his personal checking account, labeling the transfers as management fees. He was bleed prepping the estate, making sure that when I finally expired, there would be nothing left for the state to lien. But Julian had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He was so focused on the cash he could grab, now that he had forgotten the hidden asset that actually sustained his life. Years ago, I had structured our family limited partnership with a life estate provision. I was the general partner. Julian and Tiffany were merely limited partners. I looked at the automatic payment tab. There they were, lined up like a row of dominoes. The $6,400 monthly mortgage for the Greenwich Colonial, the $1,200 lease for his Tesla Model S, the $4,000 quarterly tuition for my grandchildren's private academy, the $900 monthly maintenance for the landscaping he was so worried about. Every single luxury Julian enjoyed, the very things he was willing to sacrifice my life to protect, was being funded by an automated trust account that I, and only I, had the ultimate authority to dissolve. He wasn't a successful marketing executive. He was a middle-aged man on a permanent, invisible allowance. He had been so busy checking the resale value of my engagement ring that he had forgotten who actually owned the roof over his head. The quiet wisdom that had once made me a self-sacrificing mother had vanished. In its place was a firm, decisive resolve. I felt a surge of vitality that no physical therapy could ever provide. My heart rate monitor spiked, not from distress, but from the sheer exhilarating adrenaline of a counteroffensive. I spent the next 40 minutes changing passwords, then moving the primary trust assets into a private secondary account he couldn't see, and drafting a single devastating email to my estate attorney, Sarah. I looked at the Cancel All Auto Payments button. My thumb hovered over it. I thought about the plasma center in 1998. I thought about the bruises on my arms and the nights I spent in the oncology ward holding the hands of the dying, while Julian was home sleeping in a bed I had bought for him. I thought about him signing my DNR with a smile in his heart. I didn't press the button. Not yet. A hunter doesn't strike when the prey is still in the brush. You wait until they are in the clearing, basking in their own false sense of security. I would let him move me to that trash envelope of a state facility. I would let him think he had won. I would let him stand in front of his friends and his wife and boast about how he had managed the transition. And then I would pull the rug out from under his entire gilded world. When the doctor finally entered the room, I put on my best, confused and frail face. I allowed my voice to tremble. I played the part of the burden he expected me to be. But inside I was a fortress. The silent awakening was complete. My recovery wouldn't just be medical. It would be a total reclamation of the dignity he had tried to steal. I am Evelyn Vance. I have spent my life saving people who were worth saving. Now I was going to spend my energy saving myself from the monster I had inadvertently created. The weapon was primed. The turning point had been reached. And Julian had no idea that the vegetable in room 402 was about to become his worst nightmare. There is a terrifying power in being underestimated by the person you raised. To Julian, I was a simple nurse, a woman who understood bedpans and chemotherapy dosages, but surely not the complex, cold-blooded architecture of high-finance estate planning. He saw my silver hair and my soft-spoken nature, and mistook them for a lack of strategic intelligence. He thought that because I had spent 40 years serving others, I hadn't spent a single moment securing myself. He was dead wrong. By the second week of my silent awakening, I was no longer the ghost in the room. I was the spider in the center of the web. I spent my mornings performing the role of the frail, recovering mother for the doctors, but my nights were spent on the hospital's patient tablet, navigating the labyrinth of the Vance Family Trust. Julian visited me on a rainy Tuesday, smelling of expensive rain-slicked wool and arrogance. He brought a stack of administrative forms from the state facility he'd picked out, a place called Shady Oaks that looked more like a warehouse for the forgotten than a center for healing. "Just a few more signatures, Mom," Julian said, his voice dripping with that rehearsed, hollow sweetness. He patted my hand, the same hand he'd tried to use as a rubber stamp while I was in a coma. "Since we're moving the Greenwich house into the Trust's active liquidation phase, I need you to sign off on the management transfer. It's just red tape. It ensures the kids' school tuition doesn't get interrupted by your medical complications." I looked at the documents. My eyes, which he thought were dimmed by trauma, saw every predatory clause. He wasn't just managing the house. He was trying to strip me of my general partner status in the family limited partnership I had created a decade ago. Did he really think I had become that senile? I thought, my heart beating with a steady, cold fury. Did he forget who actually sat in the lawyer's office and dictated the terms of his existence? When he left, leaving the trash envelope of paperwork on my bedside table, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I logged into my private secure portal, the one Julian didn't even know existed. In 2015, after Julian's father passed away, I knew my son's appetite for luxury was larger than his talent for earning it. I had set up a family limited partnership, FLP. To the outside world and to Julian, it looked like I had gifted him the Greenwich estate. He lived there. His name was on the limited partner registry, and he told his country club friends it was his family seat. But the legal truth, the hidden asset, was buried in the bylaws. As the general partner, I held 100% of the voting control and 100% of the authority over distributions. Julian was merely a limited partner, a title that sounded grand, but, in the eyes of the law, made him little more than a tenant at will. Furthermore, I had structured every single one of his major expenses as conditional distributions. I scrolled through the automated payment dashboard. It was a masterpiece of puppet strings. The mortgage, $6,400 monthly, paid automatically from my primary trust account. The Tesla lease, $1,200 monthly, tied to my credit profile. The Greenwich property taxes, $22,000 annually, paid by my dividends. The private school tuition, $32,000 per semester for my grandchildren, funded by my long-term capital gains. Julian wasn't a self-made marketing executive. He was a marionette. Every time he took Tiffany out for a $500 steak dinner or bragged about his new investment portfolio, he was doing it on the invisible back of a 64-year-old nurse he called a burden. He lived in a house I owned, drove a car I paid for, and maintained a social status that existed solely because I allowed the auto pay button to remain active. "So this is the power he thinks he has over me," I whispered to the empty room. I looked at the management tab on the screen, and there was a button that could terminate all automated distributions instantly if the general partner determined the limited partner had committed a breach of fiduciary duty or shown gross moral turpitude. Signing a DNR for a conscious mother and lying to a hospital about her assets to dump her in a state ward certainly qualified as both. I realized then that I didn't need a lawyer to fight him. I didn't need a shouting match. I just needed to stop being the engine that drove his life. The turning point was no longer a hope. It was a mathematical certainty. I watched the cursor blink on the screen. Julian thought he was protecting the estate from me. He didn't realize the estate was me. He had spent his entire adult life building a house of cards, and he'd forgotten that I was the one who provided the table it sat on. I began to draft a new set of instructions for my attorney, Sarah. Not for my care, I was recovering just fine, but for the upheaval. "You've forgotten who built this empire, Julian," I said, my voice now firm and decisive. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was the architect of his reckoning. He wanted to talk about costs. He was about to find out exactly how much it costs to live without the burden of a mother's grace. I closed the tablet, tucked it under my pillow, and waited for the morning light. The discovery of the puppet strings was complete. Now it was time to start cutting them one by one. The sound of my son's voice, the one I used to soothe with lullabies, now sounded like the dry rattle of a snake in the grass. It was Thursday morning, the day Julian had designated for my disposal. The transport team from Mercy West was already waiting in the hallway with a gurney that creaked with every shift of weight. Julian stood by the foot of my bed, checking his gold watch and looking at me with a mixture of pity and profound boredom. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than the monthly salary of the nurses who had saved my life. "It's time to go, Mom," he said, his voice dropping into that rehearsed, somber register he used for public consumption. "It's a fresh start, a place where they can really focus on your limitations. Don't worry about the house. I've already contacted the movers. We're going to get everything into storage so we can get the listing live by Monday." I lay there staring at the ceiling, playing the part of the non-responsive burden for one last minute. I wanted to see how far his delusions of power would go. "You're doing the right thing, Julian," Tiffany whispered, stepping into the room with a latte in one hand and her designer handbag in the other. "It's the most logical move for The kids need their stability. We can't have the estate tied up in probate while she's just lingering." "Lingering," I rasped. The word hit the room like a gunshot. Julian jumped, nearly dropping his phone. Tiffany let out a small, strangled yelp. They both stared at me, their faces turning a sickly shade of gray as I sat up in bed. No longer the frail, broken woman they had spent weeks dismissing, but the general partner they had forgotten to fear. "I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish," I said, my voice clear, sharp, and cutting through the sterile air like a scalpel. "And I am certainly not lingering on your timeline." "Mom, you're talking?" Julian stuttered, his mask of the grieving son slipping to reveal a panicked, materialistic child. "Since when? The doctors said you were in a vegetative state. They said the brain damage was..." The doctors said what you wanted to hear because you were the one paying the bills. Or rather, you were the one signing for the bills using my money, I interrupted. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My muscles ached, but the adrenaline of betrayal acted as a powerful tonic. I've been awake for 10 days, Julian. I heard every word. And I heard you discuss the resale value of my jewelry. I heard you calculate the burn rate of my life against your summer in Mallorca. I heard you sign my DNR with a smile in your heart. Mom, you don't understand, Julian pleaded, stepping forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of fake suppleness. The stress of the accident, the house, the kids' tuition. I was just trying to protect the family's future. It was a lapse in judgment. It wasn't a lapse in judgment, Julian. It was an unmasking, I said, standing up. I felt like a willow tree in a storm, bending but unbreakable. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that the Greenwich estate you're so eager to list isn't yours to sell. You're a limited partner, Julian. Do you even know what that means? It means you have zero authority. It means you are a guest in my life and you've overstayed your welcome. Tiffany began to huff, her face turning a blotchy red. Now, wait a minute, Evelyn. We've sacrificed a lot to take care of you these past few weeks. You've sacrificed nothing, I barked, and the force of my voice made the transport team in the hallway go silent. You've spent my savings on your lunches and your car payments. You've treated my tragedy like a lottery win. I reached onto the bedside table and picked up the hospital tablet. I've already spoken to Sarah, my attorney. The life estate clause has been activated. Every automated payment that funds your existence, the mortgage, the Tesla, the private school fees, it's all been flagged for immediate termination. You wanted to talk about cutting losses, Julian? Well, consider yourself cut. The silence in the room was deafening. The final mask hadn't just fallen, it had shattered. Julian looked at me, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't see a simple nurse or a soft-hearted mother. He saw the woman who had sold her own blood to give him a life he wasn't man enough to earn. He saw the strategic intelligence he had mistaken for weakness. So this is how you repay me, he hissed, his voice finally losing its veneer of civility. By making your own grandchildren homeless, over a few words said in a moment of stress? No, Julian, I said, walking toward him, with a steady gait that surprised even me. I'm not making them homeless. I'm making you responsible. You've lived your life on the back of my kindness, and you've mistaken that kindness for a doormat. But my kindness was a bridge, and you tried to burn it while I was still standing on it. I leaned in close, so close he could see the steel in my eyes. You've forgotten the most important lesson I ever tried to teach you. Never bite the hand that feeds you, because once it closes into a fist, you're the one who goes hungry. The clash was over. The turning point had passed. As I watched Julian and Tiffany scramble to leave the room, no longer the masters of the house, but two people whose credit cards were about to start declining, I felt a profound sense of peace. The humiliation was theirs now. I wasn't going to Shady Oaks. I was going home. And for the first time in 35 years, I was going to live for myself. But my kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, I whispered to the empty room as the door hissed shut. The severing had begun. Watching my son's face drain of color as the hospital billing clerk handed him back his declined elite credit card was the most effective physical therapy I'd had all month. It was the moment the theoretical became tactical. For weeks, I had been the silent observer of my own erasure. But as I sat in that high-backed hospital chair, fully dressed in the silk blouse Sarah had brought for me, the severing was no longer a plan, it was an execution. I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was the architect of a controlled demolition. Sarah, my attorney of 30 years, and a woman who possessed the legal equivalent of a shark's instinct, sat across from me with an ultra-slim laptop balanced on her knees. The room no longer smelled of antiseptic and despair. It smelled of expensive stationery and justice. We weren't just checking my vitals. We were checking the kill switches on Julian's subsidized life. The revocation of the power of attorney is logged with the state, Sarah said, her voice a calm, professional hum. And the life estate challenge has been filed. Since you're standing right here, breathing and talking, his claim of your incapacity has been downgraded from a legal maneuver to a potential fraud case. Do you want to proceed with the primary accounts? I'm not a monster, Sarah, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm just an oncology nurse who knows when a tumor needs to be excised before it kills the host. Unplug him. With a few decisive clicks, the digital umbilical cord was severed. The Greenwich Colonial, the $6,400 monthly mortgage payment, which had been pulling automatically from my Vance family trust for the last 7 years, canceled. The Tesla Model S, the $1,200 lease payment tied to my primary credit line, terminated. The Elite Country Club dues, that $900 monthly networking fee he insisted was vital for his career, voided. The private school tuition, the $64,000 annual payment for my grandchildren's education, frozen, pending a meeting with the headmaster to move them to a scholarship track or a public district. I felt a strange vibrating lightness in my chest. For decades, I had carried the weight of Julian's expectations, his failures, and his unearned luxuries. I had been the quiet wisdom that funded his delusions of power. Every time I clicked pay over the years, I thought I was building him a bridge to a better life. I didn't realize I was just building a treadmill that kept him from ever having to grow up. The door to the room swung open with such force, it hit the rubber stopper with a violent thwack. Julian burst in, his hair disheveled, his charcoal suit jacket unbuttoned. He looked like a man who had just seen his reflection in a shattered mirror. "What is going on?" he screamed, ignoring Sarah entirely. "I just tried to pay the incidentals bill downstairs, and my card was declined. I called the bank and they told me the trust account has been flagged for suspicious activity. I have a mortgage payment due at midnight, Mom. If it doesn't clear, the bank triggers the accelerated foreclosure clause on the Greenwich house." I sipped the lukewarm hospital coffee, looking at him over the rim of the cup. "It's not suspicious activity, Julian. It's a change in management. I told you, I'm no longer a burden. And since I'm not a burden, and I've decided to stop carrying your weight." "You're insane," Tiffany shrieked, appearing in the doorway behind him, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life raft. "You can't just stop the payments. We have a life. The kids have a gala this weekend. We have commitments." "Your commitments are yours, Tiffany," I said, setting the cup down with a deliberate soft clink. My commitment was to raise a son who was a man of character. I failed at that, so now I'm committing to a much simpler goal, living the rest of my life without being used as a credit card with a heartbeat. "You're making us homeless," Julian's voice cracked. The materialistic arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "The Greenwich house, it's everything. If you don't authorize that mortgage payment, we lose it all. The neighbors, the firm, and I'll be a laughingstock." "Then I suggest you start laughing," I said, standing up. My legs felt strong. "Because the severing is complete. Sarah has already sent the notification to the bank. The family limited partnership is being restructured. Since you showed gross moral turpitude by signing a DNR while I was conscious and trying to dump me in a state ward to protect your inheritance, I've exercised the termination clause. You aren't a partner anymore, Julian. You're just a tenant who is 3 months behind on his luck." "I'll sue you," he yelled, though even he knew how hollow it sounded with Sarah sitting right there. "With what money?" Sarah asked, not even looking up from her laptop. "Your accounts are empty, Julian. Your salary is barely enough to cover your tailor. And you've been living on your mother's blood, literally and figuratively, for 35 years. The well is dry." The clash was over. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to apologize for the space I occupied. The severing wasn't just about the money. It was about the spirit. I was no longer the woman who sold her plasma so he could play soccer. I was the woman who had survived him. "My kindness was never a doormat, Julian," I whispered as I reached the door. "It was a privilege, and your subscription has officially expired." I walked out of that hospital wing not as a patient, but as a sovereign. The upheaval had begun, and as Julian's world started to catch fire, I found I didn't have a single drop of water to spare. The dominoes were lined up, and I was ready to watch them fall. The first domino didn't fall with a crash. It fell with the rhythmic, frantic buzzing of my phone on a bedside table at 3:14 a.m. I was back in my own space, a modest, sun-drenched cottage in a quiet corner of Connecticut that Julian had always derided as quaint. To me, it was a sanctuary. To him, it was a reminder of the peasant roots he had tried so hard to prune away. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what the silence on the other end of the line felt like for him. It was the silence of a void where a safety net used to be. By the time the sun began to peek through the apple trees in my backyard, the upheaval was in full swing. Julian's life was a paper tiger, and I had just set fire to the forest. Sarah, my attorney, called me at 9 a.m. with the precision of a Swiss watch. "The bank has officially triggered the accelerated foreclosure clause on the Greenwich property, Evelyn, because the mortgage was tied to the life estate trust, and because you, the general partner, revoked the subsidy due to a breach of fiduciary duty. The bank no longer views the loan as secure. They've given him 7 days to settle the balance or vacate." 7 days, I repeated, sipping my tea. The steam felt warm against my face, a stark contrast to the icy hospital air I'd lived in for weeks. "And the lease?" "The Tesla was picked up 2 hours ago," Sarah said, and I could hear the faint professional smirk in her voice. Apparently, Julian tried to argue with the recovery agent in the driveway. The neighbors were out for their morning jogs. It was a scene. I closed my eyes and could see it perfectly. Julian, in his designer pajamas, standing on a manicured lawn he hadn't paid to mow, shouting about his rights while a tow truck hoisted his status symbol into the air. He had spent his entire adult life building a facade of materialistic success, never realizing that the foundation was made of my grace. Now that the grace was gone, the physics of his reality were finally catching up to him. So this is how the mighty fall, I thought. Did he really think I had become that senile? Did he think the quiet wisdom of a mother was just a synonym for vulnerability? The phone rang again. It was the headmaster of the children's private academy. He was apologetic, hushed, the tone people use when they're discussing a scandal they're secretly enjoying. "Mrs. Vance, we're so sorry to bother you." There seems to be complication with the quarterly tuition wire. Julian mentioned a banking error, but our system shows the trust account has been closed to third-party distributions. "It's not an error, headmaster," I said, my voice firm and decisive. "It's a restructuring. My grandchildren are brilliant, but their father needs to learn that an education is something you value, not something you demand as a birthright. I'll be happy to discuss a scholarship fund for them directly, but as for the current billing, that is Julian's responsibility." The dominoes were gaining momentum now. By noon, Julian was at my door. He didn't knock, he pounded. When I opened it, he looked 10 years older. The delusions of power had evaporated, leaving behind a man who was terrified of being ordinary. "You're destroying me," he roared, his voice cracking. "The bank served me at breakfast. Tiffany is packing her bags because the country club revoked our membership. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation at the firm? I'm supposed to be a partner by next month." "A partner?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. "Julian, you can't even partner with your own mother to keep her alive. Why would a firm trust you with their capital when you've embezzled your own family's soul?" "I'll pay it back," he pleaded, his eyes darting around the modest room as if looking for a hidden stash of cash. "Just authorize the mortgage payment, just for this month. I'll get a loan. I'll fix this. You can't let us go to a shelter." "You won't go to a shelter, Julian. You have a salary. You just don't have a lifestyle anymore," I said. "You'll move into an apartment you can actually afford. You'll drive a car that doesn't require a trust fund to maintain. You'll live like the rest of the world. You called me a burden because my care was too expensive. Well, now you get to experience the true cost of living. I'm your son, and I was your mother," I said, and for the first time, the choking sorrow didn't follow the words. There was only a clean, sharp peace. "But you treated me like a line item. You tried to liquidate me while I was still breathing. Never cut off the hand that is providing for you, Julian, because once that hand pulls back, you're not just hungry, you're alone." I shut the door and locked it. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because the severing was for his own good as much as mine. Like he had been a parasite for so long, he had forgotten how to be a person. As I sat back down to my book, I could hear him screaming in the driveway, a loud, hollow sound that faded as he realized the puppet strings were truly gone. The dominoes had fallen. The Greenwich house was gone. The Tesla was gone. The facade was gone. All that was left was the truth. And the truth, as I've learned in 40 years of nursing, is the only thing that can actually heal you, even if it hurts like hell when it first touches the wound. The upheaval was complete. Now I just had to wait for the final reckoning. My kindness was no longer a doormat. It was a mirror, and for the first time in his life, Julian had to look into it. There is no silence quite as loud as the one that falls when a man realizes his mother is the one holding the match to his paper kingdom. The setting for Julian's final unmasking wasn't a dark alley or a hushed hospital room. It was the pristine, white pebbled driveway of the Greenwich estate he had called home for a decade. It was a crisp Saturday morning, the kind of day designed for luxury car washes and brunch dates. Instead, the lawn was swarming. 2 black SUVs from the bank's asset recovery team sat idling near the boxwood hedges, and a trio of local real estate appraisers were huddled near the front door, clipboards in hand. But the real audience was the neighbors. The Millers from across the street were pruning their roses with surgical precision, their eyes glued to Julian, and the Wentworths were walking the dog at a glacial pace. In a town like this, a foreclosure isn't just a financial failure. It's a public execution. Julian was on the front porch, his face a frantic shade of magenta. He was waving a stack of papers at a calm, silver-haired man from the bank. "This is a clerical error," Julian shouted, his voice cracking and echoing off the stone facade. "My mother has a life estate trust. These payments are automated. You can't just freeze the assets based on a management shift. She's had a traumatic brain injury. She's not in her right mind to be making these changes." "On the contrary, Julian," I said, stepping out of the back of Sarah's car. The sound of my voice caused every head in the cul-de-sac to turn. I wasn't wearing a hospital gown or a look of choking sorrow. I was wearing a sharp, navy wool coat and the confidence of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for her own existence. I walked up that driveway with a steady gait, my heels clicking against the stones with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. "Mom?" Julian's voice dropped an octave, moving from rage to a desperate, oily plea. "Mom, thank God you're here. These people, they're confused. They think you've revoked the subsidies. Tell them about the accident. Tell them you're not thinking clearly yet." I stopped 5 feet away from him. The bank representative looked at me with professional curiosity. Sarah stepped up beside me, opening her briefcase with the deliberate slowness of a judge presiding over a sentencing. "I'm thinking with a clarity I haven't had since the day you were born, Julian," I said, my voice projecting perfectly for the gardeners and joggers watching from the sidewalk. "And I'm here to tell these gentlemen that the life estate hasn't been scrambled. It's been terminated." "You can't do that," Tiffany hissed, stepping out from behind the mahogany door, her eyes red-rimmed and venomous. "We have a contract. We have a family." "You have a parasite's lease," I corrected her. I turned to the bank representative. "My name is Evelyn Vance. I am the general partner of the Vance Family Trust. As per the conditional clauses outlined in the 2016 amendment, the general partner reserves the right to dissolve all residential subsidies in the event of gross moral turpitude or bad faith actions by the limited partner. And I have provided my attorney with the recording of my son discussing my DNR and my asset liquidation while I was conscious in the ICU. That constitutes bad faith. The partnership is dissolved. The house is no longer a family gift. It is a trust asset, and I am ordering its immediate sale." Julian's jaw literally dropped. He looked around at the neighbors, his delusions of power crumbling in real time. He was no longer the successful marketing executive. He was a man being publicly evicted by the woman who used to pack his school lunches. "You're doing this in front of everyone," he whispered, a desperate attempt to appeal to my old sense of quiet wisdom and discretion. "Think about the kids, Mom. Think about the scandal." "I am thinking about the kids," I said, and stepping closer until I could smell the stale coffee and panic on his breath. "I'm thinking they deserve a father who earns his own way, rather than one who waits for his mother to die so he can pay his country club dues. And as for the scandal, the only scandal here is that I let you believe my kindness was a weakness for 35 years. I turned to the lead appraiser. "The house is empty of my personal effects. Anything left inside, the Italian leather sofas, the wine cellar, the designer wardrobes, can be auctioned to settle the outstanding bridge loans Julian took out in my name without my consent. If he resists, the police officers parked at the end of the block have the trespass order ready." Julian looked down the street at the patrol car, then back at the neighbors, then at me. The clash was over, and he had no more cards to play. He had spent his life treating me like a trash envelope, and now he was the one being discarded. "I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish," I said, the signature dialogue of my new life ringing out for everyone to hear. "You've forgotten who built this empire, and you've forgotten the most important lesson of all. A mother's heart is a sanctuary, but her dignity is a fortress. You've been evicted from both." I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't stay to watch the movers begin their work or to hear Tiffany's inevitable hysterics. I turned my back on the cold luxury of the Greenwich estate and walked back to the car. The public reckoning wasn't about the money. It was about the reversal of gravity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one carrying the weight. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Julian standing alone in the middle of his white pebbled driveway, a small, hollow man in an oversized world. The dominoes had all fallen. The severing was complete. And for the first time, the air in Connecticut felt like it actually belonged to me. So this is how the mighty fall. They don't go out with a bang. They go out with a whimper, standing in a driveway, while the neighbors watch the tow truck take the Tesla. My kindness was never a doormat, Julian. It was a throne. And you just lost your seat. The air in the apple orchard smelled of fermenting fruit and damp earth, a sharp, honest scent that didn't need to hide behind the $300 sandalwood cologne of my son's pretension. It was 6 months after the public reckoning in Greenwich, and the world had rearranged itself into a shape I actually recognized. I was no longer a patient in room 402, nor was I the bank of Mom. I was simply Evelyn, a woman who had traded the cold luxury of a mansion built on hollow promises for a small, saltbox cottage where the floorboards creaked with history and the sunlight hit the kitchen table just right at 7 a.m. My physical recovery had been a slow, deliberate march toward independence. Every step I took through the rows of gnarled apple trees was a victory over the DNR order Julian had signed with such terrifying haste. I no longer used a cane. I no longer felt the choking sorrow that had defined my first weeks of awakening. Instead, I felt a lean, corded strength in my limbs the kind of strength you only get when you stop carrying the dead weight of other people's expectations. The consequences had been as absolute as a cardiac arrest. Sarah, my attorney, kept me updated with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Julian and Tiffany had survived the foreclosure, but they hadn't survived the reality of their own bank accounts. Without my automated subsidies, their elite lifestyle had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Julian was now living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a part of town he used to call the Sticks. He was working a high-pressure, low-commission sales job, actually working for the first time in his life, and his materialistic friends had vanished the moment the Tesla was towed. Tiffany had left him 3 months ago, moving back in with her parents after realizing that the Vance family fortune was a fortress she no longer had a key to. I received the too late apology on a Tuesday afternoon. It came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind Julian used when he wanted to look professional. Mom, I've had a lot of time to reflect on the stress I was under. I see now that I was pushed to the brink by the fear of losing everything. I hope you can find it in your heart to realize I was only trying to protect the family's future. I'm struggling, Mom. The kids miss the house. I miss you. Can we talk about a way forward? I read it twice, sitting on my porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the orchard. There was no mention of the DNR, no mention of the state ward, no mention of the burden he had called me while I was trapped in my own body. It wasn't an apology, it was a pitch. It was a man realizing the well had gone dry and trying to find a way to prime the pump one last time. So this is how they repay me, I whispered to the wind. Did he really think I had become that senile? Did he think a few lines of rehearsed regret could mend the bridge he tried to burn while I was still crossing it? I didn't reply. Some silences are more powerful than any legal document. By not answering, I was giving him the greatest gift a mother could give a spoiled child, the consequences of his own actions. My new horizon wasn't just about my own peace, though. I had used the proceeds from the sale of the Greenwich property, assets I had reclaimed through the dissolution of the partnership, to start a nonprofit consultancy. We called it the Silver Shield. It was a small operation run out of the spare room of my cottage, but it had a massive mission, providing legal and financial advocacy for seniors whose children were attempting to manage them into early graves. I spent my afternoons looking at spreadsheets not for my own gain, but to protect women like Mrs. Gable, a 75-year-old widow whose son was trying to sell her farm to pay off his gambling debts. When I spoke to these women, my voice was no longer low and fragmented. It was firm and decisive. I used the strategic intelligence that had once been my hidden asset to build fortresses around their lives. I may be old, but I am not foolish, I told Mrs. Gable during our last meeting. And you've forgotten who built this empire. Now, let's make sure you're the one who decides how it ends. The spatial contrast was the most healing part of it all. I moved from the cold luxury of hospital wings and law offices into the warm spaces of community centers, bakeries, and my own garden. My grandchildren came to visit me once a month, not because they wanted a check, but because I was the only person in their life who spoke to them with the quiet wisdom of truth. I didn't fund their galas, but I funded their books. I didn't buy them cars, but I bought them the time to figure out who they were without their father's shadow. As I walked back toward the cottage, the pacing of my life felt signifying victory. Every breath was mine. Every dollar was mine. Every decision was mine. The upheaval had stripped away the rot, leaving behind a version of Evelyn Vance that was more vibrant at 70 than she had been at 40. The sun finally set, leaving the orchard in a peaceful, cooling twilight. I was no longer a ghost. I was a sovereign. And as I looked at the light glowing in the window of my small, secure home, I realized that the new horizon wasn't a place I was going. It was the person I had finally become. The severing was over. The freedom had begun. And the willow was finally ready to share its wisdom. They say that a willow tree is the only thing that can survive a hurricane because it knows when to bow. But my son forgot that once the storm passes, the willow stands taller than the oaks that snapped in the wind. It was Thanksgiving evening, exactly 1 year since the metal of my car had crumpled like tinfoil and my life had been appraised for parts. I sat in my kitchen, the air thick with the scent of roasted rosemary, garlic, and the sweet tart tang of apples from my own trees. The house was small, warm, and filled with a silence that no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like a clean slate. The too late apology sat on the corner of my table, a stained envelope Julian had dropped off in my mailbox an hour earlier. He hadn't dared to knock. I had watched him from the window, the man who once strode through Greenwich like he owned the horizon, was now shuffling toward a rusted sedan, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a life he finally had to pay for himself. I opened the letter with the same steady hand that used to find veins in the dark of a night shift. Mom, I'm living in a basement apartment in East Haven. Tiffany is gone, and the bank took everything. I'm working 12 hours a day just to keep the lights on. I realize now that I was blind. I was greedy. Please, I have nothing left. Can I come home for the holidays? I just need to know you still forgive me. I felt a faint flicker of the old self-sacrificing mother stir in my chest, but I silenced it with the quiet wisdom of a survivor. Forgiveness is a private grace, and it does not require an invitation back to the table. I thought about the DNR. I thought about the trash envelope of shady oaks. I thought about the nights I sold my blood so he could have a life he eventually tried to use to bury me. So this is how he repays me, I whispered to the empty room. Does he really think I have become that senile? Does he think a year of struggle erases 35 years of predatory entitlement? I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't write back. Instead, I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a burden. Her eyes were sharp, her posture was firm, and her dignity was a fortress. I had learned the most highly captivating lesson of all. A mother's love is infinite, but her endurance for betrayal must have a border. Julian had reached his consequence. He wasn't in prison, but he was in a jail of his own making, a life defined by the absence of the puppet strings he had tried to cut. He was finally learning what it meant to be a man, and that was a journey he had to take without my subsidizing his every step. My freedom was his education. I walked out onto the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. The orchard was skeletal now, the trees rest enough for the winter. In the center of the yard stood the old willow I had planted when I first bought this cottage. It looked fragile. its branches swaying in the biting November wind. But I knew the truth. Its roots went deeper than the frost. It was the most strategic intelligence in nature, flexible enough to survive the crash, but strong enough to reclaim its space. As I looked out at the horizon, I thought about the philosophical lessons I would leave behind for the women I now helped through the Silver Shield. First, never mistake a woman's silence for her absence. Most of the time, she is simply auditing the cost of your presence. Second, kindness is a gift, but boundaries are a duty. If you give without limits, you are not being a saint. You are being an accomplice to your own destruction. Third, the hidden asset of the elderly isn't just money or property. It is the fact that we have already seen the end of the movie you are currently starring in. We know where the traps are because we built the map. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish, I said to the wind. You've forgotten who built this empire, and in your rush to inherit the throne, you forgot that the queen was still breathing. My life had transitioned from the cold luxury of a family that saw me as a bank account to the modest warmth of a woman who saw herself as a masterpiece. I was no longer an oncology nurse tending to the dying. I was a gardener, tending to my own soul. The signature dialogue of my life had changed. It was no longer, "What do you need, Julian?" It was, "What do I deserve?" I went back inside and closed the door, locking it with a firm, decisive click. I sat down to my Thanksgiving dinner, a small plate, a glass of good wine, and the profound peace of a woman who had risen from the wreckage of her own heart. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Julian. It was a sanctuary. And once you desecrate a sanctuary, you lose the right to seek shelter within it. I am Evelyn Vance. I have been shattered. I have been a ghost. And I have been a burden. But tonight, as the stars come out over the orchard, I am something much more dangerous to the vultures of the world. I am free. The dignity rise was complete. The willow was standing tall. And for the first time in 70 years, the only person I was taking care of was the woman I should have loved first. Never cut off the hand that is providing for you, because once that hand pulls back and points you toward the door, you'll find that the world is a very cold place for a man who forgot how to say thank you.